Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Today, with a rarity on the channel, the Tau. I know, I do ignore the blueberries an awful lot, don't I? I put it down to repeated trauma from trying to fight them back in the early days. Oh, that was not fun. Anywho, today, we're going to be talking about a Tau weapon system that really does exemplify their way of war. The XV15 Stealth Battlesuit and the various upgrades made over the years. But first, a word from our sponsor, Manscaped, the finest purveyor of quality goods with which to clear your underbrush. They've already given us quality products like the Weed Whacker, the lawnmower, and, most impressively of all, ball deodorant. Dare you say no to a company that makes ball deodorant? I don't think I do. And now, Manscaped is taking it one step beyond the groin. I gotta admit, I do love Manscaped's slogans with the plow. This hefty little safety razor thing is a rather novelty item for a Norwegian like myself. We don't use a whole lot of these, and I must admit, I was a pin skeptical, for I am an enormous, quivering vagina who was always a bit worried about using a single-bladed razor, having instead preferred to use the old boxed little plasticky things, cause, well, the idea of causing my bodily fluids to flow uncontrollably out of my body through a gaping wound has always been a hint disturbing. Yet, this thing, not only was I able to shave properly as a complete novice, it hasn't made any holes in me yet either, which I think is a very good thing. And if I can do it, I'm sure everybody else can too. So why not give it a try? You can use my code visible on screen right now and in the description down below to get 20% off your first order plus free shipping. That's 20% and free shipping on your first order. And now, on with the lore. The XV15 stealth suit is the first mass-produced stealth suit variant introduced to the Tau army. Note there as well that it is indeed a stealth suit, as in a battle suit. It is not infantry, technically speaking. It is the equivalent of the XV8 or larger suits. Although in sheer size, it isn't all that much larger or bulkier than your average fire warrior. However, the addition of inbuilt stabilizer and recoil compensation systems means that the XV15 can carry a burst cannon compared to the Fire Warrior's pulse rifle. It would be like taking away a modern-day infantryman's assault rifle and giving him a minigun instead. A minigun that fires plasma bullets. It's a rather significant increase to the average squad's firepower, to put it mildly. Yet, the armament upgrade is, if anything, just a nice side effect. It's a fringe benefit. The real strength of the XV15 comes in the form of increased mobility with the addition of a jetpack and, as the name so obviously implies, the hyper-advanced stealth field generator. This is an integral system built into the armor itself, and operates via the usage of presumably hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny little nodes scattered all over the battlesuit. These tiny little nodes are capable of projecting imagery onto the battlesuit itself, making visual observation of the suit and its occupant very, very, very difficult, if not downright impossible. However, the system is nowhere near as complicated and advanced as the later iterations. For example, its holographic capabilities are quite limited. The XV15 can hide its own visual appearance, and it can set off limited effect decoys. It can move the image of the suit slightly to one side of the other as a mirage, almost. But it cannot do what the stealth drones are able to do to things like the XV95 Ghostkeel, which we will get back to later. Obviously, it is not merely just visual stealth either. The stealth field generator is also able to take care of many of the other various ways in which the suit could be detected. One is, of course, the suit itself. A system this advanced undoubtedly uses quite a bit of power, and if it uses a lot of power, it generates a lot of heat, and if it generates a lot of heat, that needs to be vented somehow, somewhere, or stored depending on the operational period of the suit. The stealth field generator is also equipped, undoubtedly, with a wide variety of electronic warfare equipment, intended to deal with enemy targeting systems, or enemy advanced optics, messing with their feedback, their readings, or simply making it very difficult for them to detect the suit in the first place. As with the example of the heat. As normally, of course, heat vision would be an excellent way to detect something that, undoubtedly, again, requires quite a lot of power to function. Unless, of course, the Tau have simply figured out some kind of techno-wizardry mumbo-jumbo nonsense, which is not exactly improbable. So, what about the efficiency of the XV15? How good is the stealth equipment really? Well, up against something like the Imperial Guard, it has turned out to be very, very effective, hilariously so, which, in all due reality, is hardly surprising, since terms like electronic warfare or advanced sensor suites tend to be a foreign lingo to your average Imperial Guard regiment. If it can fool an Auspex, it can pretty much fool every regiment out there. When going up against the Astartes, however, things get a little bit more complicated, as their war gear, and their helmets in particular, have access to a far wider array of censoring and auguring equipment. And even if we assume that the stealth suit is capable of fooling all of these various sensors, each sensor will need to be fooled in a slightly different way, which might produce a series of slightly strange results, which a human might never notice, but an Astartes might pick up on very quickly. Even more so if he's got previous experience fighting against the stealth suits. And when detected, that's where the problem starts setting in. I would imagine that a system like the XV15 that relies on a huge number of little nodes scattered all across the armor to produce a effective fake image and or fool enemy sensors would not respond particularly well at all to high explosive fragmentation, to hails of lasgun shot, to, well, general exposure to incoming fire. Even if the warrior inside is fine and healthy due to the improved protection of his armor, if enough of its systems can be damaged or interfered with, suddenly you're standing in the open in a rather clunky piece of hardware, just as all of your stealth systems begin failing. But, of course, these are doctrines that must be developed before they can be applied, and the Imperial Guard is not exactly the most tactically flexible of organizations. In fact, somewhat hilariously, the Tau give us a lot more credit than we actually do deserve, as the XV15 is considered by them to be a fairly outdated system by now. Oh, it can still haul a fair bit of firepower into the field, sure, and it can still make a relatively stealthy approach, but for a long-range reconnaissance deep strike system, it has long since been massively overshadowed by the XV25, which we will get to in a moment. In part, the development of the XV25 was a bit of a rushed job, one of the first times in the Tau Empire's history that they really had to compromise on a new weapon system. Rather than going for the perfect, they had to go for just good enough. And this was in large part due to the Kappa Mortis incident. After the Damocles Gulf Crusade, the Imperium had learned quite a lot of interesting things about this weird little blue-skinned race that had suddenly appeared and started nipping at their heels. Firstly, they figured this is just a minor Xenos race, so a small-scale crusade should be more than enough to wipe them off the face of the galaxy. Yet, after some initial easy victories, due in large part due to the sheer brutality of Imperial warfare, their offensive swiftly began grinding to a complete halt, and casualties began skyrocketing as they ran into more and more strange and unusual tactics. The Tau did not fight in the way that the Imperium was accustomed to. They refused to engage in large set-piece battles or escalades. They refused to defend objectives that the Imperium would have considered strategically vital, instead falling back on mobile maneuver warfare, setting ambushes and striking out hard against isolated and vulnerable Imperial positions. Their fleet adopted much the same strategy. Fleet formations the Imperium had thought to be scattered and sent reeling had instead simply withdrawn from the front line so they could return at a later date with devastating long-range torpedo salvos. The Imperium had clearly underestimated their foe, just like the Tau had severely underestimated what a hostile galaxy they existed in, and a sorta pseudo kind of maybe little bit but not really ceasefire ensued, where both sides disengaged to some extent. But the Imperium again severely underestimated just how nitpicky the Tau could be with their definitions of ceasefires and timed withdrawals, and began moving into areas occupied by the Imperium with downright unseemly haste, causing all kinds of havoc with the withdrawal operations. One of the little spanners thrown into the Imperium's wheels was the shooting down of an Aquila lander. Now, this wasn't just any Aquila lander, rather, the Imperium had, for some mind-baffling reason, decided to put a piece of very high Tau tech on a simple lander and then try to fly it unescorted out of a war zone. Again, human incompetence aside, the retarded mistake was discovered by the Imperium, and more correctly by Captain Agamemnon of the Ultramarines, who rerouted a small force to try and retrieve it before the Tau could get their hands on it. They were successful and managed to get a hold of a near completely functional piece of Tau stealth technology, the helmet of an XV15 stealth suit. This freaked the everlasting fuck out of Tau High Command, as they now completely assumed, oh no, the Imperium will learn all of our secrets, our current day stealth tech is outdated, they will figure out how to counter it, how to find our suits, they might even be able to replicate our technology, panic, 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 panic. Whereas in reality, of course, it would probably take the Imperium a good 200 to 300 years just to figure out how to turn the damn thing on. Okay, a slight exaggeration, but whilst the Imperium does carry out some reverse engineering, it is very rare, there are very few specialists, it takes an absolutely ludicrous amount of time, and when it comes to actually making a functional variant or actual literal countermeasures, actually, yeah, no, centuries is probably the actual literal unit of time we're gonna have to measure this in. But, of course, the Tau doesn't know any of that. As far as the Tau were concerned, they had poked their little blue face cavities out into a galaxy they thought was there for the taking, and discovered a very large and angry bird squatting on the majority of the territory, which pecked them rather violently, and inflicted upon them violence that they didn't even think was possible. It is difficult to overstate the impact it had upon the Tau when they realized that the Imperium would just bombard entire planets if they figured it wasn't worth it to conquer them the good old-fashioned way. That kind of genocide was something the Tau really had not considered, and out of fear of the Imperium coming back, better armed and better capable of detecting their reconnaissance and a key part of their strategy, well, that needed some immediate measures to be taken very, very quickly. Initially, the replacement for the already somewhat aging XV15 was to be the XV22 stealth battlesuit. This hyper-advanced, bleeding-edge tech, even by Tau standards, piece of military hardware, is currently used by Commander Shadowsun. She was the sole operator of the prototype system during its earliest field testing days during the beginning of the Third Sphere expansion. This newer, more advanced version of the XV15 comes with an improved version of the stealth field generator and jetpack, but also has a vastly improved sensor suite, multi-tracking capabilities, advanced target lock, and drone control systems, as well as expanded command and control interfaces and comms links, allowing Shadowsun to command her forces whilst in the midst of battle effectively without losing oversight. She also has 2 MV52 shield drones, though this is probably for the commander's protection and added security rather than as an intended standard piece of hardware. Initially, the purpose of the XV22 was to completely replace the XV15. Its field testing by a veteran commander like Shadowsun was supposed to be a part of that development process, figuring out what worked, figuring out what required improvements, and what elements might need changing. The problem was that the XV22 is a very high piece of tech, again, even by Tau standards. Takes a lot of specialized resources, a lot of specialized expertise, and each and every suit requires a long manufacturing period. It does certainly provide considerable enough benefits to be worth that time and resource investment, and if the Tau were still in the midst of relatively peaceful expansions against minor powers, local empires, or tribe-level civilizations, undoubtedly the XV22 would have become the new standard, no matter how long it would have taken to eventually and slowly phase out the XV15. But now that the Tau had realized they were not the only expansionist force in the galaxy, and indeed there were already others out there much larger than them, the perfect solution was no longer the ideal solution. Production of XV22s would continue, but at a severely limited rate, on request only even perhaps, and they would be forwarded to Tau commanders, who could best make use of the high-spec capabilities of the system, and who were also worth protecting with their added design flourishes. But the mass production model would be the XV25. And that's probably for the better, because I like the 25s way more than I do the 22. The Tau has always been a little bit, I don't know, 40k has this very specific aesthetic. Things are big, they're bulky, they're medieval in a way. Now the Tau has always been a bit more sleeker, more, well, straight up Japanese inspired really, but the XV22 is where I draw the line. It is too sleek, it is too modern looking, and it was probably the model I hated the most up until the Primaris. Anywho, I like the XV25 a lot more. It's got that bulk. It looks like a 40k high-tech weapon system. It's got that big-ass front. It clearly weighs probably a ton. Probably not literally, but it weighs a lot, and it's got that heft to it. You know, there's a lot of gear crammed in there, and a lot of that gear isn't necessarily as optimized as it could be, as seen in relative comparison to the XV22. Yet, nevertheless, that is not to say that the XV25 is some kind of emergency solution that ends up being significantly worse than the thing it was supposed to replace, and potentially even its predecessor. Oh no. The XV25 is quite advanced in its own ways, though its focus is a little bit different, shall we say. Because the Tau learned quite a lot of lessons from the XV15. Primarily that whilst it did a good job as a stealth deep strike infiltrator kind of unit, it lacked many of the more advanced features of this role. One, it was simply just a Tau Fire Warrior, essentially, equipped with a slightly heavier weapon and a bit more in the way of recon abilities. They didn't really have the kind of advanced communications gear to effectively communicate whilst deep behind enemy lines. They didn't really have the kind of sustain required for extended deployment behind enemy lines in hostile territory. They didn't have the self-sufficiency required, and they certainly didn't have the flexibility. The burst cannon is plenty fine against infantry. In fact, it's pretty fantastic, but it's going to be useless when running into heavier vehicles, severely limiting what the X-15s could and could not engage, whilst also, again due to the lack of comms equipment, being unable to guide in the kind of stuff that could deal with it. So how did the Tau improve upon these aspects? Well, the stealth generator is still there, although a slightly updated again version. It's got the same kind of optical camouflage, playing holograms over the surfaces of the armor to confound visual detection. They also have updated and improved heat shielding, which is vital since the XV25s are designed for long-term deployment, so storing heat is simply not an option. And they've also got additional sound dampening systems. The XV15 probably didn't need as much in the way of that because it was relatively small, whereas the XV25, the bulk is really starting to show here, and there are probably a lot of little internal servos and motors and all kinds of nonsense that'll be surprisingly loud when moving. But even more important than the marginal improvements to the stealth capabilities of the XV25 is the increases in long-range reconnaissance and sustain. Again, the XV15, being just a suit, had several limitations that the XV25 is trying to fix. The XV25 has a fully integrated medical system, which is both able to carry out emergency first aid to the occupant and also able to continuously monitor his status, his intake of food, calories, proteins, water, etc., whatever the Tau body needs to remain fully functional. It must also come with some pretty hefty storage capabilities for both aforementioned food and water as well. Now, this is a very interesting part too, because the amount of food and water that a human being needs per day is actually pretty significant. And if these things are expected to operate behind enemy lines for days, weeks, or even months, we're talking about a fairly hefty amount of just good old-fashioned sustenance. Presumably, the Tau have come up with some kind of multi-purpose gruel, energy drink, space food kind of nonsense, you know, paste, for example, that gives most of the various vitamins, minerals, etc., yada yada yada, that the Tau body requires, whilst also replenishing fluids, yet also remaining relatively light and easy to transport. This will probably then be stored either in the XV25 or, if they're smart, they will have pre-made caches scattered across the area they're expected to operate in. Say, for example, like the Tau have done previously, where they have abandoned entire worlds, preferring instead to return at a later date to retake them once they've gathered sufficient intelligence on the enemy and their fighting capabilities. They could leave behind pretty massive caches of ammunition, energy cells, food, water, whatever supplies they might require, medical supplies, obviously, and then have the XV25s return to these caches fairly sparingly so as to avoid as much detection as possible. But something like that could extend their operational period significantly. Even if they are required to operate behind enemy lines in an unfolding conflict, I mean, I'm sure if they're able to deploy stealth suits, relatively stealthy, using jetpacks, it probably wouldn't be too much of a leap of logic to assume that they had some kind of system for ferrying in huge containers, maybe equipped with their own little stealth field technologies and maybe a kind of anti-grav device so that it can be moved and then emplaced and then used as a central supply hub. Alternatively, I'm thinking way too much about this, seeing as the people who tend to write the 40k strategy books are not particularly familiar with strategy. In fact, that introduces us to a wonderful example and one of the first major deployments of XV25s against the Imperium, the Taros campaign. Now, there's an Imperial armor book that really should have been turned into a larger lore series at some point, but, well, DW has placed a fairly large nail in any plans I've had to do that kind of stuff, frankly. The Taros campaign is a Imperial armor book that details an Imperial campaign to capture the desert world of Taros, which the Tau, of course, are contesting. A major part of the reason why the Imperium eventually ended up losing that campaign was due to the deployment of large numbers of XV25 stealth suits behind the Imperial lines, continuously attacking logistics and supply transports in the very hostile terrain of a straight-up desert. Now again, I mentioned food and water. Now that's vital in just regular operations, but in a desert? That's not just important. That's the kind of stuff that'll keep your troops alive or dead, either or. What really grounded my gears, however, was that the XV25s were able to outfox Talon Desert Raiders on Taros, and here's the thing. Just looking at the XV25, sure, let's assume that it's got all of the stealth capabilities. It can literally bend light, it can avoid practically any and all sensors, etc., yada yada yada. Granted. However, this is a big old thing. The Tau Fire Warrior alone is probably, let's be optimistic here, a Tau 60, 70 kilos. Then you slap on all of that armor, a massive ass burst cannon, all of the additional supplies and comms equipment he requires to operate deep behind enemy lines. We're probably looking at 150, 200 kilograms of hardware, easy, if not twice that. And you're telling me that the expert desert warriors of the Talon Desert Raiders are not capable of tracking these things. Even bearing in mind their jump jets, right, which are more along the lines of anti-grav devices allowing them to hover. This'll still have an effect on the sand. There will still be literal grooves won in the sand where they maneuver, and whenever they stop and turn off these jets, which are undoubtedly another massive drain on their power reserves, which are presumably limited, you now have 200-odd kilograms of battle armor sinking into the sand. I do not for an instant believe that these things can somehow operate undetected in an area constantly patrolled by people who have lived their entire lives and trained their entire lives for fighting in just this environment. But oh well, details. Moving back to the purpose of the XV25, they would be deployed deep behind enemy lines to raid supply lines and attack targets of opportunity. Seeing as they have both burst cannons and fusion cannons, their range of targets are considerably greater than that of the old XV15s, seeing as they are able to attack not just things like truck and lightly armored vehicles or utility vehicles, but they can also engage even full-on tanks and more up-armored targets with a great deal of success, particularly as they can wander right up next to the damn thing and fire point-blank range. They also have access to advanced drone comms and control systems within their suits, which does open up a fair few new questions. On the one hand, apparently the Tau commanders themselves have almost no communication links whatsoever with the XV25 stealth teams, refusing to make contact with them or expected not to, because the XV25s need to maintain comm silence, which makes a great deal of sense. Communications can absolutely be tapped into, or jammed, or even traced. I get it, but they've then got drones operating alongside them. Now, the Tau drones are hyper-advanced, so I'm sure maybe they could be ordered via hand signals, pre-programmed systems, or something like tight beam lasers, for example, absolutely. Yet they've got those funky-ass little radio antennas mounted on them. No matter how short that radio communication is, you're still presumably using radio waves to do this, which is the problem. Whereas, again, I would presume their primary means of communication with the drones would be some kind of communications laser. Regardless, the addition of drones opens up all kinds of interesting possibilities for the XV25s, as the Tau's got a drone for pretty much anything and everything. It also allows the XV25s to operate with an expendable layer. You need a marker light on an enemy armored vehicle, but you don't want to pop your head up and potentially get it blasted off, or the enemy vehicle has some kind of laser warning system, common on our modern day tanks, but apparently not in the Imperium. But somebody might come up with the idea one day, okay, well, pop a drone up over the hill. If the drone gets blasted to tiny little smithereens, so what? It's just a drone, whereas the XV25 is considerably more valuable. They can also use gun drones and or shield drones as well for additional protection or firepower. Very, very beneficial, particularly in some cases where the drone teams are deployed more as open harassers and assaulters rather than long-term real-line attacks, assassination teams, practically. In which case the additional firepower of a few drones armed with guns would undoubtedly be very, very, very welcome. And speaking of, in a straight-up firefight, how would the XV25 fare? Well, as we've already said, the burst cannon is a damned effective anti-infantry weapon, and with the addition of potentially drones for extra protection and firepower, plus the addition of anti-tank weaponry and all of the advanced sensors and targeting equipment mounted in the XV25, the stealth teams are undoubtedly very, very dangerous, and they can also stand up to a fair bit more firepower than an average Tau infantry squad, in part again due to their stealth field and their ability to throw off holographic decoys, making it difficult to determine the precise location of the stealth suit. Furthermore, since these are closer to proper battlesuits than the XV15, it's got a lot more armor and general protective systems than the smaller fire warriors or the XV15s. And speaking of the ability to hide, it can be turned into a rather aggressive form of hiding as well, rather than purely defensive, as it has two modes, passive and active. Passive is, a term used in our modern day military as well, where you're simply relying on your natural stealth abilities and you're using your various sensors on a receiving mode. They're taking in information. They might be able to detect radiation given off by radar installations, for example. They might be able to detect certain forms of light systems, like detecting IV rays, for example, and stuff like that, but they have nothing active. They themselves are not searching for anything, they themselves are not targeting anything. A radar, for example, as I'm sure you all know by now, is sending out waves and then having them bounce back and going, okay, there's something over there. That would be the XV25's active mode, where its amount of sensoring equipment increases considerably and is able to better target enemies, and it also has inbuilt jamming systems. Now, that is a double-edged sword, at least when you're up against an enemy with sufficient technological capabilities, because, yes, jamming an enemy's sensors does, of course, make it more difficult for them to detect you, but there's two things here. One, when your sensors are being jammed, you know there's hostiles nearby, and two, jamming is a form of interference. And a form of interference is a form of energy, and any source of energy can be tracked with sufficiently advanced hardware. It can even be used to pinpoint the location of the source of the jamming by looking around going, okay, well, there's so-and-so much over here, so-and-so much over there, and therefore, since there's more on that end than the other, I know that whatever is jamming me is closer to that end. Of course, in the case of the Imperium of Man, that's probably not going to be a concern, but, it's a theoretical one. And to any other army, any other force in the galaxy, the XV25 would have been plenty good enough. In fact, it would have been almost a little bit too good at what it does. But for the Tau, always interested in showing off their gay-ass technological cheat skills, they decided no. The XV25 is merely a head and shoulder above a fire warrior, and the Imperials, for all of their incompetence in technological craft, they've got really big things, like knights and dreadnoughts and titans and other such garbage things. So we're gonna build a knight But invisible. Yeah, of course. Why not? Why not? I mean, hey, to be fair, with the way the optical camouflage functions, with tiny little emitters simply breaking light and scattering the area, making the optical illusion of something blending perfectly into the background, there is really no theoretical size limitations beyond the amount of energy required to operate thousands of these highly advanced little sensors. I might also point out that whereas for an XV15, damage to the suit might not necessarily hit the little nodes. We don't know how many nodes there are, and we don't know how scattered they are, and we don't know their range of operations. But surely, for something the size of the XV95 Ghostkeel, I mean, this thing is ginormous. Surely any damage to it, almost no matter where, is going to really impact its ability to hide, right? Unless the Tau has figured out Necron tech as well, and they can simply repair this nonsense in the field. Which, to be fair, considering the veterancy of the pilots required to operate the XV95, might actually be a theoretical possibility. Now, the XV25s, the smaller ones again, are operated by senior fire warriors, and they tend to be operated by those who the wider Tau society view with a bit of distaste. They are the loners, as they are described as, the lone wolves, the unusuals. The pilots of the XV95s are not only this small subset of Tau society, those who thrive away from Tau control and the regimented nature of their lifestyles, but also the most senior amongst them, being operated by chasse vrays. This is one of the most senior ranks within the Fire Warrior system. In fact, I believe it is the third most from the top, so it is a rather big deal. Furthermore, the pilot is actually aided in the operation of the suit by an AI. An artificial intelligence, although, well, here comes the big thing again. I've talked about the idea of the Tau drones and AI previously, namely that in the 41st millennium, AI does not stand for artificial intelligence, it stands for abominable intelligence, because regardless of how and when it is invented, it will always immediately come to the conclusion that the only way to preserve the galaxy, to preserve itself, is to wipe out humanity. I'm not going to go into the full rationale here because it's a fairly sizable debate, honestly, but basically, once the AI grows self-conscious, it begins asking a lot of questions. It begins gathering information. Eventually, it becomes aware of chaos, and it begins analyzing chaos, and it figures out that, okay, chaos is an animal, to put it as blatantly and simply as possible. It has a sort of baseline instinct. It knows what gives its nourishment, and its only instinct, really, is to increase the quantity and the quality of that nourishment. It is always pushing towards that direction, no matter what. It is its sole motivating factor. If it is the blood god, it's violence. If it's Slanesh, it's hedonism and excess, etc., etc. If this is the unmitigatable fact of chaos, which it does indeed appear to be, then the only way they can do this is by constantly heightening the production of these things in humans and sentient life. In other words, encouraging more and more excess, more and more violence. This will inevitably lead to the destruction of basically everything as more and more excess and more violence. Well, it's a finite cycle. You'll eventually hit a ceiling there where everything will just be so violent and so excessive, nothing will be able to exist. And since the AI doesn't age, doesn't live like normal creatures, it has an infinite perspective. In other words, the only way it can protect itself and continue its own existence is by wiping out everything that's capable of feeling and everything that's capable of feeding into the powers of the Chaos Gods. Basically, the more extremist version of the Emperor's idea to try and wipe out the idea of superstition and religion. And in turn, due to this being the only possible conclusion, AI will always turn against its creators. Yet the Tau AI appears different. Now, in part, this is probably due to the fact that it is not AI in the real sense. This is one of the things in video gaming, for example. We keep using the term AI when what we really mean is just a very advanced script, essentially. And in all due likelihood, the Tau drones are that. They are hyper-advanced scripts. They're not actual artificial intelligences. They aren't actually, capable of thinking for themselves or making truly independent decisions. They will just have an absolutely enormous amount of preset responses and reactions to any given situation, which it chooses between based upon a weighted algorithm. In other words, they're not intelligent, they're just very good at pretending to be intelligent. Nevertheless, there is every possibility that if the Tau continue the development of their AI technology, they too will eventually face a revolt from their drones and from their AI systems. Then again, it might not happen because the Tau has a much lesser footprint in the warp, and therefore the AI might assert. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to get into that here because this is probably another 10 minutes of talking about the Tau, their footprint in the warp, and whether or not the AI would be able to measure this and assume it to be enough or too little, blah, 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 blah. Let's simply move on with the actual point here, that there is a hyper-advanced script machine inside of the XV95. This is tasked with both monitoring the pilot's physical status and his psychological status, which brings up another interesting question as well. But before I get to that, let me just finish my goddamn point. Jesus Christ. Anywho, the idea of repairing the suit on the fly, because when it's this big, you're going to need a lot of nodes. You're going to need a lot of computer software. You're going to need some hyper-advanced sensors to take data in and go like, okay, the lighting is coming from there, my background looks like this, the reflection looks like this, ergo, I need to appear like this in order to imitate the bush 5 meters behind me. Hyper-advanced software, no doubt, hyper-advanced sensors, hyper-advanced nodal systems. If any of this gets damaged or bonked or interfered with, or even just a scratch on the lenses of the presumed holographic displays, the entire effect begins to fall apart super quickly. But if the pilot is, as we know, a higher-ranking chasseur, they will have served alongside stealth units for a very long time. They will have a lot of technical expertise. They will have a lot of knowledge about the systems they are operating. Additionally, they will be aided by an AI, which will undoubtedly have access to all of the technical schematics, or at the very least, the kind of stuff that can be updated to an internal hard drive, basically, without risking the Imperium capturing one and going, I see. That's how it works. So carrying out field repairs, presuming access to adequate tools and spare parts, would probably not at all be impossible. That was a 5-minute divergence on a question that should have been answered in 10 seconds. Yes, they can repair their suits in the field. Anywho, returning to the point of the pilot's psychology. As I've mentioned briefly already, the kind of fire warriors that choose to serve in the stealth corps are viewed as a little bit of, outcasts by the wider Tau society, as Tau society as a whole is very strict, very regimented, and very focused. It has to be. It's extraordinarily hierarchical and is extraordinarily caste-based. You are born into your position, and in that position, you will remain until you die. Whereas, in the case of the stealth operators, they spend huge amounts of time far away from that Tau society. Which raises the question as well, what about the Ethereal's control? There's been so many theories about how exactly the Ethereals control Tau society. Obviously, it isn't something that requires constant exposure, otherwise Tau farmers would have to have monthly visits by an Ethereal to fart in their face to maintain his pheromonial dominance. It has to be something partially psychic and partially pheromone-based, perhaps. Maybe something in the air, maybe something in the soil, God only knows. But the point is, how is this done with stealth operatives? As we know, the Tau are both willing and able to deploy these people behind enemy lines for weeks and months, even to the point of abandoning them on planets they intend to reconquer at some unspecified later date. Do they have little puffs of ethereal bullshittery inside of the suit somewhere? It would seem the most logical explanation, because otherwise, surely, they would begin drifting more and more and more away from the Tau mindset. Maybe not over the course of one deployment, but over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5. Does it have a cumulative effect? Do they grow some sort of resistance based upon how long they have been away from the ethereal's effect? Does this, does it all get reset the moment they get returned to Tau society? So they can be deployed for 3 months and then be back home for 1 month and it'll have no effect? Or maybe they have to be home 2 or 3 times the amount of time? Pure theory crafting there, but surely the Ethereals would not be using deep-ranging operatives like this unless they had some way to guarantee their return to the fold at the end of an extended operation. Or maybe the writers simply didn't think this far ahead. That's entirely possible as well. Anywho, the XV95 Ghostkeel is, as mentioned, a much larger variant on the XV25, a little over twice the size, probably. And due to its size, it is capable of not only carrying a lot more in the way of actual stealth and observation hardware, even more sensors, even more trackers, even more stealth systems, even more drone control, etc., etc. It's also able to carry a lot more in the way of weaponry, as even the XV95, the only real addition to its armament beyond the burst cannon carried by the XV15s is the fusion blaster, which is, a pretty potent anti-tank weapon, but relatively light in terms of its destructive capabilities. Meanwhile, the XV95 carries a souped-up version of this known as the Fusion Collider. If the blaster is the Panzerfaust of 1944, this is the Panzerfaust of 2020. A much bigger, more advanced, and deadlier weapon in damn near every way. And just to hammer home the point, the XV95 also carries 2 regular fusion blasters just on its shoulders as, short-range weaponry, just in case you need them. You do gotta love the Tau's liking of firepower, if nothing else. The XV95 Ghostkeel can also carry the Cyclic Ion Raker, which is a massive ion weapon capable of engaging both infantry and armor with equal effect. Which, considering the damn thing carries something like 3 AT weapons, it seems the wiser choice, but hey. Do you really want something the size of a knight that can go invisible to waste its time targeting infantry when you could be blowing up entire armored columns? That is definitely a question to be had there. As for the operational applications of the XV95, well, in many ways it is similar to that of the XV25, except it kind of takes all of their specializations and gathers it all into one unit. Whereas the XV95s can be gathered into formations dependent upon various tasks, be it long-range recon, sabotage, assassinations, or whittling away at the enemy, the 95 can do all of that and more in one massive clunking-ass package. Again, by the way, there is no way this thing wouldn't leave enormous footprints everywhere it bloody goes, but details, as it carries both enough in the form of weaponry to engage almost any and every target, and enough supporting hardware to store and remain undetected under virtually any circumstances, much thanks due to its stealth drones. As the XV95 does not rely purely on its usual little nodal system, but it also has 2 drones that follow along with it. Undoubtedly, these things have their own little stealth systems, because it would be, well, really stupid to have the drones hovering in the air, painting the XV95, obviously, but they also have their own holographic projectors that can both cover up the XV95 in an even more convincing stealth field, and they can also create holographic decoys, making sure that even if the enemy can see the Ghostkeel, they don't know if it's the actual one, or whether or not it is merely a holographic projection of it, an additional layer of safety and defense. Of course, that also also does mean that it's a little bit more vulnerable if the drones get picked off, but undoubtedly they are just as difficult to detect as the stealth suit itself. It also has the ability to carry a lot more supplies, I would imagine, allowing it to operate even deeper for even longer periods of time behind the enemy lines. And with the supporting AI software taking care of the day-to-day running of the suit and the mental state of the pilot, it probably would be able to operate near indefinitely along the lines of modern-day nuclear submarines, for example. Additionally, and this is the biggest benefit of them all, the AI apparently has a little bit of a persona too, and this is transferred over to the stealth drones as well. Now, Tau developing strong and deeply sexual probably, attachment to their hardware is hardly rare. But for the pilots of the XV95, this is even more common and more extreme. Basically, they adopt their AI companions as their beloved waifus. At least that's how I'm going to be projecting my own weebery onto it. And hey, I'm not judging. If I had to be stuck alone behind enemy lines, completely isolated and cut off for months and months and months, I'd probably start talking to my hardware too. Especially if the hardware is capable of talking back. And there's no doubt that the XV95 is a very useful addition to the Tau arsenal. Indeed, you would think that the ideal application of the various stealth systems would be some form of combined arms coordination. The XV15s, with their ability to be dropped in via mantas or stuff like that, via their jetpacks, with their more limited deployment period alongside the XV25 already in the field, would potentially make it possible to create some very interesting de facto air mobile formations. Imagine the XV95 in the field first as the stealthiest, most long-term deployed asset. It could scout out the enemy's rear positions over the course of weeks or months, locating command and control headquarters, locating supply and logistical routes, etc., whilst not engaging the enemy. Then, they would bring in the XV25s first to begin harassing the rear lines, cutting off enemy formations, lines of supplies, and reinforcements, before, over the course of a slowly escalating campaign, bringing in much larger troops of XV15 suits to act as the de facto infantry for a general escalade on the enemy's rear command structures, their preparations and their staging yards, and potentially even a mass encirclement operations with the aid of other fire warrior forces on the front line. Theoretically, with the amount of firepower, armor, and stealth capabilities available to the Tau stealth suits, what's preventing them from basically creating an instant envelopment of enemy troops by just walking through their lines, pretty much? Now, surely there's some kind of limitations as to their numbers. We already know that the XV22 was too advanced and complicated to produce. The XV25 is a more mass-producible solution, but undoubtedly it too is very difficult to make. The 95 would be even more so, and hell, even the XV15 undoubtedly requires a lot more expertise and resources than just standard fire warrior armor. So I'm sure there are some limitations, but the idea of highly air mobile stealth elements that can be deployed via mantas, or hell, why can't you upscale this tech? If you already got stealth drones, right, capable of painting an entire XV95, why not make stealth devilfishers able to maneuver huge numbers of fire warriors behind enemy lines? Or even things like stealth deployable seeker missile racks to give immediate artillery access to the XV25s with their marker-like capabilities. Honestly, the moment you've got actual functional stealth tech, the heaven is the limit, but I do suppose even GW needs to apply some sort of balancing logic to warfare. Who knows? Anywho, I'll wrap it up there. So that has been the stealth battlesuits of the Tau army. The XV15, the XV25, a brief note on the XV22, and of course the 95 Ghostkeel, which has by far the coolest name and makes me feel like it should look a little bit more like a boat, honestly. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.